The first opponent is Fischer's greatest rival, Boris Spassky. Fischer starts e4 best by test and is faced with e5. Knight f3 pressures the pawn and knight c6 defends. Bishop b5 marks the Ruy Lopez. This move attacks the knight, undermining the defense of e5. The threat to take the knight, however, is merely an illusion, since black would recapture with the pawn, opening the d-file, and if white were to take the pawn on e5, then queen to d4 would fork the knight and win back the pawn. Still, bishop e5 is a good move because it develops, prepares to castle, and sets up a potential pin to the king. Black continues with the most popular move, a6, forcing the bishop to make a decision. In this case, Fischer captures the knight. Black recaptures with the d-pawn, opening up his pieces, and white castles. Black's f6 is a good way to defend the e5 pawn, because in this position, white's usual tactics of capturing on e5 with the knight, then playing queen h5 check, wouldn't work because black has king to d7 available. Fischer, in aggressive fashion, plays d4, pouncing at the center. Black captures and white recaptures with the knight. c5 forces the knight to retreat, leading to a queen exchange, which slightly favors black. This is because white has more active pieces, but with no queens on the board, it's more difficult to create an attack and exploit this advantage. Black plays bishop g4 while hitting the rook. Fischer creates a sturdy pawn chain with f6 blocking the attack. So the bishop retreats to e6. White's knight c3 develops, and black brings out the other bishop to d6. Bishop e3 adds another attacker to c5, so it's defended with b6. a4 aims to undermine the pawn chain, and black should respond with a5. But a5 would weaken control of the b5 square, allowing the knight to jump in, which is probably why black opts to castle long instead, putting the rook on the open d-file. Fischer pushes forward with a5, and the threat is to take the pawn, opening the a-file, and then take the free a-pawn. Black meets this threat with king b7 defending. Then white plays a very clever move, e5. This move opens the e4 square for the knight. Black cannot take with the bishop because it would hang the rook. If he took with the pawn, then white would first open the a-file before jumping the knight to e4, where it would attack the bishop. The bishop shouldn't move, as black would exchange rooks, and then play knight takes c5 twice with a fork on the king and the other bishop. This would win 2 pawns for white. The only other option would be to defend with the king, but this leaves the a6 pawn hanging, and black's position would be crumbling. Back to the game, black plays the only move to keep things in the balance, bishop e7. Fischer exchanges rooks, forcing the bishop to the back rank before jumping his knight to e4, threatening again to take twice on c5 with the fork. This is where black goes wrong. He should either capture the knight or defend the pawn with his bishop. Instead, he plays king c6, getting his king out of the potential fork. Fischer capitalizes on this mistake by taking on b6, opening the a-file, and after black recaptures, he takes the pawn on c5 anyway. This is because if black were to recapture, then white would take on a6, skewering the king to the bishop. If the king were to go to d7, then knight takes c5, it lands a fork. And if the king were to go to d5, then rook d6 forks the king and the bishop this way. Back to the game. So black retreats the bishop and white captures on a6 with the knight. Black desperately tries to keep things even by capturing on e5 before Fischer plays the winning move, knight b4 check. At this point, black resigns. Black has quite a few options, but the best possible continuation is king c7. This would allow the rook to infiltrate with check, and the king shouldn't go back because knight c6 is checkmate. So the bishop would have to block. White would sacrifice the exchange, setting up knight d6 check. The king would move, and then knight f7 would win back the exchange. After grabbing the rook, Fischer would be up a pawn and a piece, and you could argue that this knight is trapped, but when it eventually tries to escape, he'll probably win at least another pawn. The next opponent is James Tirone, and we enter the Ruy Lopez. Black chooses a6, and this time Fischer drops the bishop back 1 square, keeping an eye on the knight. Black develops the other knight to f6, hitting e4. White does not defend it, instead castling with the plan of meeting knight takes e4 with rook e1, or d4, followed by rook e1. Black, understanding white's intentions, plays bishop e7, preparing to get his king out of the center. Fischer follows with rook e1, defending the e-pawn. After black's d6, white jumps at the chance to capture the knight, ruining black's pawn structure on the queen side. Then, with black's king still in the center, white tries to break things open with d4. The e5 pawn is under attack, and black capturing on d4 would allow knight takes d4, which is pretty irritating. So black defends the pawn on e5 with knight d7. Knight b to d2 develops with the plan of adding more pressure on black's center. At this point, black should really get castled, but he plays bishop f6, defending e5 in anticipation of white's next move, knight c4. The knight here is quite powerful, so black immediately tries to dislodge it with knight b6. Fischer plays knight a5, and although a knight on the rim is usually dim, in this case, this knight is putting a lot of pressure on black's queen side. Black plays bishop d7, defending the threat on his c6 pawn. White follows with b3, preparing to capture on e5, opening a nice diagonal for his bishop. Then black finally castles. Now Fischer takes on e5, black recaptures with the pawn, and bishop a3 is played, attacking the rook. Rook e8 dodges the attack. White's c4 expands on the queen side, and with white's immensely influential bishop, black plays bishop e7 to contest it. But that was a big mistake. c5. The knight is attacked, and its only safe square is c8, but this allows the magnificent knight b7, and black resigns. The black queen is entombed by her own pieces, and white will pick her up on the next move. The third opponent is Clarence Bell, and he chooses to meet Fischer's Roy Lopez with the interesting move bishop b4. This develops while preventing the immediate d4. Still, it allows Fischer to play c3 with tempo, and after the bishop moves, in this case to c5, white can play d4. Black captures the pawn, giving white a powerful central pawn duo. The bishop is also under attack, so it moves back to b4 where it gives the white king check. The knight jumps to c3 to block, before it is immediately captured and white recaptures. Black continues knight f6, attacking e4, and Fischer cleverly castles, planning to meet knight takes e4 with rook e1 and bishop a3, preventing black from castling. It's best for black to play it safe and castle, which he does. White's bishop to g5 pins the knight, and it's really difficult to dislodge this bishop. h6 is played, but the bishop just moves back one square, maintaining the pin. White's next move will be d5, and if black tries to prevent it with d6, white will move the queen off the same file as black's queen, preparing the unstoppable d5. Remember that if black plays rook e8, this self-pins the knight, which was a key defender of d5. Black tries something else. Knight e7. This lets Fischer decimate the black king's shelter, but at least the knight is nearby to defend. White follows with knight h4, bringing the knight closer to the attack and opening up the queen. Black plays d6, opening his bishop and preventing any knight f5 ideas. Then white lunges forward with f4, planning a rook lift. Black's f5, stopping further white expansion, is followed by queen h5, infiltrating the black king side. The h6 pawn is under attack, so king h7 defends it. Then white takes the pawn on f5. Here is where black slips up. He really should play knight d5, followed by knight f6, locking down the king side. But maybe black succumbs to the insurmountable pressure of playing against Bobby Fischer, leading to this fatal blunder. He recaptures the pawn with the knight. White takes full advantage, playing bishop d3, which is a deadly pin, and the knight has 3 attackers, so there's no hope. He moves the king out of the pin. Fischer grabs the knight with his bishop, and then black's queen comes to the defense. But it's too little too late. The white rook jumps to f3 with one target in mind. Black captures the bishop, and white recaptures with the knight while giving check. The king shifts to h7, and white captures the pawn on h6, sacrificing back the knight, which black takes with the queen. Now put yourself in Fischer's shoes and try to find the winning move. Queen f5 check, and black resigns. The threat is to play rook h3, which would win the queen. And whichever piece went to the g-file, let's say the queen, then white would just play rook h3 check, forcing the king and queen onto the same file before pinning and winning the queen. The fourth opponent is the American Grandmaster Arthur Bisgeier, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with the standard a6. Fischer retreats the bishop while keeping an eye on the knight, and black develops the knight, pressuring the center. White castles, indirectly defending the e4 pawn by way of the impending rook e1. Next, black plays b5, forcing the white bishop to retreat, and then plays bishop b7, putting the bishop on a nice diagonal. With black's king still in the center, Fischer, as usual, tries to break it open with d4. Black captures the pawn with the knight, leading to a pair of knights being exchanged. Now white chooses the most active approach, c3, hoping for black to waste a move by capturing, and white can then develop the knight for free. Black instead captures the hanging pawn on e4. Fischer swiftly shifts his rook to e1, creating a potent pin, and f3 is incoming. Black responds with a tricky move, bishop d6. This makes f3 impossible, as it would severely weaken the king side, and queen h4 would be devastating, with ideas of sacrificing the bishop on g3 if it were played. White calmly plays knight d2, piling up on the pinned piece without falling for any traps. Black again plays another tricky move, bishop takes h2 check. If white were to capture, then black could force a draw by way of queen h4 check, followed by queen takes f2, and then repeating back and forth. Fischer, of course, would never settle for a draw, playing king f1. Now black must defend the knight, and d5 is played. White follows with the nice double threat, queen h5, hitting the bishop and threatening to take the knight because of the pin on the d5 pawn to f7. Black could play d6, defending the bishop, but things would get incredibly dangerous after white takes on f7. Instead, black castles, letting his piece go on h2. Now, if we count the material, black has 3 pawns for the piece, which means material is still technically even. Black captures on c3, and in return, white captures the knight on e4. Black recaptures the knight, and white recaptures the pawn. Material is still even, but things are slightly simplified. Black plays c5 with c4 incoming, locking down the bishop. Fischer continues with rook e3, a clever way to activate his rook. c4 hitting the bishop is followed by bishop c2 hitting the pawn. Black plays queen f6, pressuring the c3 pawn, and because of this, white should not capture on e4. If he does, then the rook would eventually be deflected away from c3, black would take it, with the double threat of taking the rook in the corner and forking the rook and the king. White would be forced to exchange queens, leading to this endgame where white's 3 pawns for the piece are starting to become more and more advantageous. Back to the game, Fischer plays the best move, rook f3, hitting the queen and exploiting the pin to the h7 pawn. Black's queen is forced to move, then the rook goes to h3, hitting h7. The move h6 would lead to a bishop sacrifice with devastating consequences, so black must defend the h6 pawn with his queen. Then bishop e3 comes, setting sights on the d4 square. Rook d8 puts the rook on the open d-file, and white activates his own final piece, preparing for the incoming attack. Black's rook d7 has the idea of eventually defending the kingside laterally. Fischer plays bishop d4, aiming another piece at the king. Black continues rook e8, and white plays rook h5, attacking the queen. If the queen were to move to g6, then white would lift the other rook, and there's not much black can do to stop the attack. Instead, black plays g5, blocking the attack. Fischer's response, g4, induces a black resignation. This is because if the queen strays too far, then rook takes h7 threatens a virtually unstoppable checkmate. So black has 2 options. Queen g6 would lead to rook h6, trapping the queen. The other option is playing queen f4, after which white would exchange queens, play rook g5 check, forcing the king to f8, and bishop c5 would win the exchange and the game. The next opponent is the American international master Walter Shipman, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with knight d2, planning to recapture with the other knight if white were ever to take. In response, Fischer plays c3, preparing a central pawn break, only to be met by a central pawn break by black. But in moving the d-pawn, a pin on the knight to the king has been formed, allowing white to take the pawn on e5. In response, black captures white's pawn on e4. So white pressures it with queen e2 while defending the bishop. In anticipation of black's next move, queen d5, hitting the knight and defending the pawn. Fischer captures the knight on c6 and black replaces it with his other knight. Then comes d4, gaining a foothold over the center. En passant is not possible because of the pin to the king. Black plays bishop f5, developing while supporting e4, and white develops the knight to d2, attacking e4. Then both sides castle, albeit in opposite directions. This sets the stage for a sharp and exciting game. Black drops the bishop back, making way for his f-pawn to get rolling, and Fischer jumps his knight to the queen side while opening up his bishop's eyes. Black's f5 expanding is followed by bishop e3 with the plan of pushing c4 and d5 to open up the bishop's gaze. In anticipation of c4, black retreats his queen, but this was a big mistake. Fischer captures the knight, and with the queen nowhere near, the pawn recapture puts the black's king shelter in ruins. Queen a6 check comes next, and were the king to go to b8, then knight a5 would lead to an unstoppable checkmate. So the king is forced to go to d7. Knight a5 comes anyway, attacking the c6 pawn, and black defends it with queen e6. Fischer plays c4, preparing to play d5 when the time is right. Black's bishop e7 is followed by rook d1, lining up the rook with the king. Rook b8, putting the rook on the open file, is finally followed by d5, and black is in a real pickle. The queen must defend the c6 pawn, but if she were to go to f6, then there would be bishop d4. And if she were to go to d6, then there would be c5. So black is forced to capture, opening up the queens to one another. White recaptures with the rook, giving check, and black is forced to block with the bishop. Fischer doubles his rooks on the e-file, and the threat is to take the bishop, and then play queen takes a7, forcing the king to the back rank, after which white can take the rook for free. This allows a nasty fork, knight c6. The king moves, white wins the rook, and black recaptures. Then, like we saw earlier, white takes the bishop on d6, black recaptures with the pawn, and queen takes a7 forces a black resignation because of the fork. Fischer just absolutely crushed a chess master and made it look easy. The sixth opponent is Laszlo Barce, a Hungarian chess grandmaster, beats Leroy Lopez with a6. Fischer drops his bishop back, and black replies knight f6, pressuring the center. White castles, preparing rook e1, and black plays bishop e7, preparing to castle as well. After rook e1, white actually threatens to take the knight and win the e5 pawn. To see why, suppose black castles. White would take the knight, and after black recaptures, white takes the pawn on e5, and in this case, queen d4 forking the knight and pawn wouldn't work because white has knight f3 hitting the queen, and the queen can't take the pawn because it's defended by the rook. Back to the game. For this reason, black plays b5, forcing the bishop back to b3. d6 comes next, solidifying the center and opening up a lane for his bishop. White's c3 prepares a central pawn break, and black castles. If white were to immediately play d4 here, then black would play bishop g4, pinning the knight, and that knight was a key defender of the center. White would have a ton of trouble supporting his center. So a crucial preparatory move is h3, stopping the bishop from getting to g4. At this point, black decides that his knight on c6 really isn't doing much, so he moves it back to b8 with the plan of remaneuvering it to a square where it can have more influence. Fischer thrusts forward in the center with d4, and black continues his plan with knight b to d7 while defending e5. With the knight now blocking the bishop, white jumps the knight to h4, eyeing up the f5 square. Black captures on d4, resolving the tension, and white recaptures with the pawn, getting a strong central pawn duo. Black plays knight b6, eyeing up some squares on the queen side, and preventing f5, so white's knight, having done its job, returns to f3. Now, Fischer's pawn center is incredibly intimidating, so black plays d5, challenging it. White gains space with e5, and black jumps the knight forward to e4. White immediately challenges the knight with knight d2, and black captures it, allowing white to develop his bishop by recapturing. Then black develops his bishop to f5, and with white's light-squared bishop staring at a robust pawn on d5, white drops it back to c2, challenging black's bishop. This leads to an exchange of bishops and white's queen landing on c2. Black follows with rook c8, preparing the c5 pawn break. Fischer responds with b3, preventing the knight from jumping forward. So it drops back to d7, where it can further support the c5 pawn break. Then white marches forward with e6, forcing the e-file to be open. Black captures the pawn, and white recaptures with the rook, hitting the pawn on a6. Then black finally storms through with c5. This entices Fischer to play a tricky move, bishop a5. The queen captures the bishop and is hence deflected away from the defense of the bishop. White captures it on the next move. Now black's knight is hanging. Black should really move it to f6, and he could also insert pawn takes d4 if he wanted. But he makes the mistake of playing queen d8, defending the knight while counterattacking the rook. Can you find the winning move that Fischer plays? The move Fischer plays is knight g5, prompting black to resign. This threatens checkmate on h7. There are only two ways to stop checkmate, but both of them would lead to the same outcome. That is, rook to g7, forcing the king to capture the rook, and then knight e6 with the remarkable royal fork. This was a tremendous tactical shot by Fischer. The penultimate opponent goes by the name of Robert Walker, and his response to the Ruy Lopez is a6, and after bishop a4, the immediate b5, forcing the bishop to retreat to b3. Black then immediately hunts down the bishop with knight a5. Meanwhile, the e-pawn is hanging, but knight takes e5 would first be met with knight takes b3, and then queen g5, forking the knight and the pawn on g2. So Fischer castles, and black snatches the bishop off the board, which in turn gives white an open a-file to work with. The e-pawn is finally defended with d6, before white thrusts forward in the center with d4. To defend the pawn again, f6 is played. Fischer in aggressive fashion plays knight h4. This creates the threat of queen h5 check, since black cannot block with g6, as white would take the pawn, taking advantage of the pin to the rook. In light of this, black plays knight e7, defending the g6 square. White continues his development with knight c3, and black replies bishop e6 to control the weakened light squares around the king. Fischer's bishop e3 is followed by g5, attacking the knight. It doesn't move an inch, however, as the queen springs to f3, threatening a double attack on the bishop and the rook. Black defends this with bishop g7. Then white captures on e5, threatening another fork by capturing on f6. So black recaptures the pawn, and white's knight finally moves, leaping to f5. That knight is a little too powerful, so black must capture it. He can't do so with the knight because it offers white a valuable tempo on the bishop, giving white time to play a move like bishop c5, which would prevent black from castling. So he instead captures the knight with the bishop, and white recaptures. Black castles, and Fischer brings his rook to the open d-file where it attacks the queen. She moves to c8. Then white's bishop moves to c5, pinning the knight to the rook. Now black could defend the knight, and he probably should, but it would give white an advantageous position after he captures the knight. In particular, he would have a good knight versus a bad bishop position, as most of black's pawns are on dark squares. So instead, black captures the pawn, giving up the exchange, but at least his bishop now has a chance to become more active. Fischer moves his knight forward, attacking the f6 pawn, so black defends it with his king. But this was a big mistake. If you think you know why, then take a second and try to find the winning move. The move Fischer plays is g4, prompting black to resign. This is because the knight would have to move, and the white queen would turn into a gourmand, eating far too many pawns for black's liking. White was already up in exchange too, on top of all the pawns he would have won. The final opponent is the world-class Grand Meller. He meets the Ruy Lopez with a6, and after bishop a4, d6. Fischer castles, and black immediately pins the knight to the queen with his bishop. White's h3 kicks the bishop back to h5. Then c3 prepares to advance in the center. Black plays queen f6, piling up on the pinned piece, so white breaks the pin entirely with g4. After the bishop retreats to g6, white storms forward in the center with d4. But the e4 pawn is hanging, and black takes it. Fischer's knight b to d2 defends the knight while attacking the bishop. The bishop goes back to where it came from, and we notice that even though white just lost a pawn, the e-file is opening up and the black king is not excited. White captures the knight on c6, removing one defender of e5. After black recaptures, white takes on e5. Black recaptures with the pawn, and white cunningly captures again with the knight. Black, of course, should not take the knight because of rook e1 pinning and winning the queen. So black develops his bishop to d6, and white captures the bishop on g6. Black could recapture with the h-pawn, opening the h-file, but he prefers to capture with the queen so that he can later use his h-pawn to break down the white king side. Next, Fischer plays the long-awaited rook e1 check, and the king hides away on f8. Then the knight jumps forward to c4. Black plays h5, and white grabs the bishop. After black recaptures, white is able to develop with tempo by hitting the pawn. Black pushes the pawn to safety, but surprisingly, this was the losing move. Fischer plays queen b3, planning to exploit the newly opened diagonal towards the king. Black, in a desperate bid for counterplay, takes the pawn on g4. Then white plays queen b7, threatening the rook. Pawn takes h3 with a discovered check looks frightening, but Fischer, unfazed, simply blocks with bishop g3. Black's rook to d8, preventing bishop d6, is followed by queen b4 check, and black resigns. It's hopeless. Black's best bet is to block with the knight, only for it to be captured before losing the rook as well. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.